I never thought moving into a seemingly quiet, picturesque suburban neighborhood could turn into one of the most bizarre, stressful, and ultimately satisfying experiences of my life. My name is Ethan Cole, and I had spent months searching for a place that would give me both peace and a sense of belonging after years of bouncing from city to city for work. I finally found a charming two-story house nestled on the edge of what I later discovered was a private lake, complete with a small dock, willow trees drooping gracefully over the water, and a kind of serenity that made me feel instantly at home. On the day I first saw it, sunlight glinted off the lake, birds chirped in perfect harmony, and the smell of freshly mown grass filled the air. I imagined myself sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, letting the day's stress melt away as the water lapped gently at the shore. But, of course, paradise rarely stays untainted in stories like mine. The neighborhood was governed by a homeowners association, or HOA, as they like to brandish it in every email, flyer, and passive-aggressive notice, and it became clear almost immediately that the person in charge of enforcing order was a woman named Karen Montgomery. People in the neighborhood whispered her name like it carried weight, and from my very first interaction, I understood why. She had the kind of presence that demanded attention, from her perfectly coiffed hair to the sharpness in her voice that could slice through any rational conversation. I first met her on a crisp Saturday morning, right as I was unloading boxes from the moving van, hauling my life piece by piece into my new sanctuary. She came striding down the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, heels clicking like a metronome of impending doom. "Mr. Cole," she said, voice sweet yet sharpened with authority, "I'm Karen Montgomery, president of the Willow Lake HOA. I'd like to welcome you to the neighborhood, but first, we need to discuss your compliance with our lake membership policies." Her words were calm, but I could feel an undercurrent of control, a subtle suggestion that the lake, and by extension, the entire neighborhood, was hers to command. I set down a box of books and tried to smile politely, telling her that I was eager to become part of the community. But she cut me off before I could even finish. "Before you get too comfortable," she said, her eyes scanning my face as if she could read my thoughts, "you should know that access to the lake, the dock, and any recreational privileges is conditional. And joining the HOA lake membership is mandatory for all new residents." I frowned. I had spent months researching the area, and not once did I see anything indicating that my new property was part of a restricted lake association. "I actually own the property," I said carefully, and the listing didn't mention any HOA requirements for the lake. The house and land were sold to me outright. Karen's lips pressed into a thin line, and she tilted her head slightly, as though weighing my words against some invisible ledger in her mind. "Ownership doesn't exempt you," she said finally. "The lake is private, and all residents must adhere to HOA guidelines. Non-compliance can result in fines, restrictions, and other measures to ensure the integrity of our community." I blinked, processing her words. There was something about the way she said "other measures" that made my stomach tighten. Most HOAs I had dealt with were annoying, yes, but threatening? This felt different. My instincts told me that backing down wasn't an option, yet I also understood that challenging her outright could spark a conflict that would make moving day a living nightmare. I tried to remain calm. "I'd like to see the documentation that mandates this," I said. "I've reviewed my property deed and county records, and there's nothing indicating a mandatory lake HOA membership. Could you provide the legal basis for this requirement?" Karen's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought she might storm off in frustration. Instead, she smiled, that unnerving blend of sweetness and steel, and said, "Why don't we discuss this more, privately? I'd like to ensure you understand the rules before things escalate." That's when I first sensed that this wasn't just about paperwork or lake access, it was about control. She wanted to test me, to see if I would yield to her authority without question. And I wasn't going to. Over the next few days, I tried to maintain civility, but Karen's presence grew more intrusive with every interaction. Flyers appeared on my porch reminding me of lake rules I hadn't agreed to. Neighbors, who I had hoped would be friendly, seemed hesitant to speak openly, their expressions betraying fear of crossing her. Every time I tried to contact the HOA board for clarification, I was met with delays, vague responses, or, occasionally, Karen herself appearing at my door unannounced. The tension escalated to a point where I realized this wasn't about the lake or the membership, it was about intimidation. And that's when I decided I wasn't going to back down. I began documenting everything, photographs of my property, copies of all HOA correspondence, and recordings of interactions when legally permissible. I researched local laws regarding property rights and private associations, ensuring I had a rock-solid understanding of my legal position. All the while, Karen's behavior became increasingly aggressive. One afternoon, I returned home to find a stern letter nailed to my front door, an official-looking notice demanding immediate compliance with the HOA lake rules, threatening fines of up to $5,000. I stared at it in disbelief, my mind racing. I had legally purchased the house, I owned the land, and yet here was a demand implying that my rights as a homeowner were negotiable at the whim of this woman. I called the HOA office, demanding to speak to the board members. The receptionist, who sounded timid over the phone, assured me that the board would review my case, but I could hear Karen in the background, murmuring something about teaching new residents a lesson. My patience was running thin, and a part of me began to realize that this conflict wasn't going to resolve itself. It was only a matter of time before she escalated the situation beyond paperwork. And then, one morning, as I was organizing tools in my garage, I saw her car parked at the end of the driveway. My heart sank. She was watching. I stepped outside, trying to confront her with calm authority, but before I could say a word, she lifted her phone, dialed, and started speaking rapidly. My instincts screamed at me, something was coming. Within minutes, I noticed flashing lights at the end of the street. Cops. Real cops. Karen had called them, claiming I was trespassing or violating HOA rules, though the exact words she used were deliberately vague to maintain plausible deniability. As I approached my property, officers stepped out of their vehicles, hands on their belts, scanning the scene with serious expressions. I raised my hands slowly, prepared to explain, but also fully aware that once they knew who I was, the entire dynamic would change. And that's when I reached into my pocket and pulled out my badge, the kind that instantly shifted the balance of power in situations like this. Their eyes widened as they registered it, and Karen, still on her phone, froze completely, a mixture of shock, disbelief, and sheer panic crossing her face. In that moment, I knew the narrative was about to flip, and that all her posturing, all her threats, had just collided with a reality she hadn't prepared for. The moment I flashed my badge, the tension that had gripped the air for days snapped like a brittle twig. The two officers immediately straightened, their expressions shifting from routine caution to careful deference. I could feel Karen's body stiffen beside her car, her phone slipping slightly from her hand as she finally registered who she was dealing with. She had thought she could manipulate the system, bend it to her will like she had with the neighbors, the HOA, the lake, everyone who dared to cross her. But she had underestimated me. "Ethan Cole, Willow Lake," I said, voice calm but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone trained to command attention in high-stakes situations. "I'm on official business, and I am at my residence. Can one of you explain why you're here?" The taller officer glanced at his partner, confusion flickering across his face, and then nodded at me. "Sir, ma'am called in a complaint regarding trespassing and property violations," he said, carefully choosing each word. "We received the call around 10 minutes ago. We were just following up." I raised my hand, cutting him off. "I understand procedure. But I'm the property owner, and I am authorized to be here. There is no trespassing, there is no violation. Any actions taken against me without proper legal documentation are invalid. Karen, is that clear? Karen's lips trembled, and for a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. I just thought, she stammered, her voice faltering. She was grasping at straws, trying to maintain authority that had evaporated the instant my badge entered the equation. Her attempt to manipulate the law, the police, and even the neighborhood hierarchy had failed spectacularly, and she knew it. I took a step closer, keeping my movements deliberate, calm, and measured. Everything I had learned in years of law enforcement told me that presence and posture could disarm an opponent far quicker than words alone. Karen, I said, voice steady, I advise you to step back from any further actions regarding this property. The HOA's rules do not override my legal ownership, and any attempt to coerce me or intimidate me from accessing my home is considered harassment. Understand? Her eyes flickered between me and the officers, and finally, she nodded reluctantly. I understand, she whispered, though I could see the storm brewing behind her eyes. The officers relaxed slightly but stayed attentive, clearly trying to reconcile the situation in real time. One of them, a younger officer with a hesitant demeanor, glanced at me and asked quietly, "Sir, do you want us to stay for a while, just in case?" I shook my head. "No, thank you. I can handle this. But document everything in case the HOA tries any further illegal actions. That includes unauthorized fines, harassment, or trespassing attempts." Karen, still holding her phone, finally ended the call she had started. I could practically see her scheming mind racing, calculating damage control. But I had anticipated her moves long before she made them. I had evidence, legal documents, recorded correspondences, all the proof necessary to protect myself and make sure any attempt to assert unlawful authority would backfire spectacularly. I watched her gather herself, straighten her posture, and attempt to put on a mask of authority. "Well, I suppose there's a misunderstanding," she said, forcing a sweet tone that didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe we can find a compromise." I laughed softly, shaking my head. "Compromise isn't necessary, Karen. Compliance with your HOA rules isn't mandatory when those rules contradict the law. That's not a suggestion, that's a fact. You might want to take some time to review the legal documents regarding property rights in this county. They're very clear." She froze again, her facade cracking. I could practically see her calculating which threats, fines, or intimidations could be legally enforced, and realizing that none of them would work against me. "I will review them," she said finally, the words heavy and reluctant. I nodded once, letting the weight of the moment sink in. This was more than just a victory for me, it was a statement. I wasn't someone who could be bullied or manipulated into compliance with arbitrary rules, no matter how much power an HOA president thought she had. Over the next few days, I noticed a shift in the neighborhood dynamic. Karen's usual presence of dominance seemed diminished. Where she had once walked the streets like a queen ruling her subjects, now she kept her distance, casting furtive glances toward my property. Neighbors I had barely met began to smile, wave, and even share bits of their own frustrations with the HOA, as if my public stance had given them permission to finally speak without fear. I spent my evenings reviewing HOA bylaws, property law, and local ordinances, documenting everything meticulously. I even began preparing a formal complaint detailing Karen's repeated harassment, backed by photographic and audio evidence. If she tried to retaliate, she would find herself on the receiving end of consequences far beyond anything she had previously imagined. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk along the lake, my steps deliberate as I passed the manicured lawns and perfectly trimmed hedges. Karen appeared on the sidewalk, clipboard in hand, as though nothing had changed. She opened her mouth to speak, but I merely lifted my hand in a calm, authoritative gesture. The expression on her face was priceless, a mix of frustration, disbelief, and reluctant acknowledgement that she had lost this round. I continued my walk, the gentle lap of the lake against the shore and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind a stark contrast to the tension that had dominated my first week here. It felt like reclaiming my space, not just legally, but psychologically. Karen, as if realizing her influence was waning, retreated, muttering something about enforcing rules in due course, to herself. I had no doubt that she would continue to try and assert control, but I had learned something invaluable. Authority without legitimacy is empty, and intimidation can be dismantled with patience, preparation, and unwavering resolve. That night, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the lake in shades of gold and crimson, I felt an immense sense of satisfaction. I had turned a situation designed to intimidate and control me into a declaration of personal sovereignty. And deep down, I knew that Karen's attempts to undermine me would only escalate, and I was ready for every challenge she could throw my way. For the first time since moving in, I truly felt like I owned not just the house, but my space, my boundaries, and my peace. And I smiled, knowing that the coming days would test her, not me. The calm I had felt sitting by the lake was short-lived. Karen's defeat, as satisfying as it had been to watch, seemed only to ignite a new level of obsession. She became relentless, her attempts to assert control morphing into increasingly creative, and absurd, schemes. Flyers appeared on neighbors' doors, subtly implying that I was a troublemaker who disregarded the HOA rules. Anonymous emails, clearly sent by someone with insider knowledge, landed in my inbox, suggesting that complaints were being filed daily against my property. I knew immediately who was behind it, and it didn't take long to track the source. Using my professional background and experience in investigations, I gathered timestamps, metadata, and IP information, proof of her attempts at intimidation. I made a mental note that everything she did now would only serve as additional evidence if legal action became necessary. Karen, seemingly undeterred by my display of authority with the police, escalated in person as well. She began showing up unannounced during mornings when I was mowing the lawn or fixing minor repairs. Her clipboard became her constant companion, and she would hover near the edge of my property, muttering about lake standards and community compliance, as if mere presence could coerce obedience. I decided to turn her obsession into an opportunity. Instead of confronting her immediately, I began documenting her appearances, noting times, dates, and any audible threats or inappropriate remarks. My goal wasn't just to defend myself, it was to create a record that could demonstrate harassment, intimidation, and potential abuse of HOA power. One particularly audacious morning, I discovered her standing at the dock, measuring the length of my private pier with a ruler and muttering under her breath about violations of lake access regulations. I stepped out onto the porch, crossing my arms and speaking in a calm, controlled tone that I had learned to deploy over years of training. "Karen," I called, my voice carrying across the water, "please step off my property. You are not authorized to inspect or measure anything here. Your personal opinions do not constitute law or enforceable rules." She turned sharply, her eyes wide with the audacity of being caught, and for a split second, I saw pure frustration. "I'm ensuring community standards are met," she said, her voice shaky despite the attempt at authority. I didn't flinch. "Community standards do not grant you the right to trespass, harass, or intimidate a homeowner. Step back now." She hesitated, then, muttering something about reporting and board directives, finally retreated, her heels clicking angrily on the walkway. That afternoon, I decided it was time to be proactive rather than reactive. I drafted a formal letter to the HOA board, carefully outlining every instance of harassment, intimidation, and unauthorized action Karen had taken against me. I included timestamps, photos, emails, and the metadata from the IP addresses that traced the anonymous messages to her devices. I sent the letter certified, demanding a response and emphasizing that any continued harassment could result in legal action. Within hours, I received a reply, not from Karen, but from the HOA attorney, expressing concern over the documented behavior and requesting a formal meeting to resolve the issue. This was the first tangible crack in her armor. Karen had spent months building an image of invulnerability, convincing the neighborhood she wielded ultimate authority. Now, I had the HOA and legal counsel on record questioning her actions. The shift in power was palpable, and I could sense it in the nervous glances she cast at me whenever we passed on the street. But Karen wasn't done. If anything, she had doubled down on psychological tactics, sending carefully worded letters implying that I had somehow violated lake regulations and suggesting fines, in accordance with HOA bylaws. She was trying to manufacture compliance, hoping that the weight of her letters alone would intimidate me into submission. I smiled, reading one particularly florid example over coffee on my porch. Her words were venom wrapped in civility, a transparent attempt to coerce without risking legal liability. I immediately forwarded the letter to my attorney and prepared a concise rebuttal, citing every applicable law and my property rights. At the same time, I began speaking more openly with neighbors, subtly educating them on their own rights and the limits of HOA authority. It was astonishing how many people had quietly suffered under her reign but were too intimidated to speak. As I explained the legal framework, property rights, and documented incidents, I could see a shift in the community, fear giving way to curiosity, and eventually, confidence. The moment Karen realized her control over the neighborhood was slipping, her behavior escalated again. One evening, I arrived home to find a large stack of notices nailed to my door, each more outrageous than the last. Claims that I was disturbing the aesthetic harmony, violating lake usage etiquette, and even a bizarre accusation that my dock's alignment was somehow offensive to communal sensibilities. I laughed out loud, shaking my head. The lengths she would go to manufacture authority were staggering. I began cataloging each absurd accusation, creating a comprehensive dossier. I also installed security cameras at strategic points around my property to capture any unauthorized visits or surveillance attempts. Karen's obsession, rather than intimidating me, was fueling a meticulously documented record of harassment. The psychological game had shifted. What she intended as a weapon against me was now an arsenal I could wield if necessary. By the third week, the HOA board had called a formal meeting to address the complaints. Karen entered the room with her usual confidence, but it was visibly shaken. I walked in calmly, badge in pocket, dossier in hand, and a firm sense of authority that could not be undermined by her theatrics. As the meeting progressed, it became clear that Karen's attempts at coercion had backfired. Board members, who had once deferred to her, began questioning her motives and the legality of her directives. I presented my evidence methodically, never raising my voice, letting the facts speak for themselves. The stack of documented harassment, the timeline of unprovoked visits, and the digital footprint of her attempts to intimidate me left little room for interpretation. Karen's face grew paler with each piece of evidence I laid out. When I concluded, the room was silent for a moment, the weight of accountability settling in. Board members murmured amongst themselves, clearly shaken by the extent of her misconduct. I left that meeting with a sense of triumph but also caution. Karen was still capable of desperation, and desperation could lead to reckless action. That night, as I sat by the lake watching the moonlight ripple across the water, I reflected on the unfolding events. The lake, which had once been a source of potential conflict, now symbolized resilience, strategy, and patience. Karen's obsession had inadvertently provided me with leverage, insight, and an opportunity to assert my rights decisively. And while the battle was far from over, I felt a sense of clarity. Intimidation can be dismantled, authority without legitimacy can be exposed, and preparation combined with calm resolve can turn even the most aggressive adversary into a defeated figure scrambling to regain control. For the first time, I felt not just like a homeowner, but a strategist, fully aware of the landscape, anticipating moves before they were made, and ready to protect my space, my property, and my peace at every turn. The days following the HOA meeting were tense, a quiet before the storm that I could feel pressing against the edges of my carefully maintained calm. Karen's desperation was palpable, her every move now tinged with urgency and fear. She had realized, whether consciously or subconsciously, that her usual tactics, intimidation, manipulation, veiled threats, no longer held power over me. The community, which she had spent years molding into a chorus of compliance, was beginning to see the cracks in her facade. And Karen, ever the perfectionist, couldn't tolerate imperfection. She was determined to regain dominance, no matter how reckless the attempt. One Monday morning, I pulled into my driveway to find her vehicle parked sideways across the street, blocking my view of the lake from the front of the house. I stepped out, keys still in hand, and she immediately emerged from her car, clipboard clutched like a shield. "Mr. Cole," she said, her voice deceptively calm, "I need to speak with you about a new violation that has come to my attention. The lake's ecosystem requires certain adherence, and your property appears to contravene these standards." I paused, studying her expression. There was a subtle tremor in her voice, a fissure of uncertainty that betrayed her nervousness. "Karen," I said, my tone measured, "please step onto the sidewalk. You are not authorized to enter or inspect my property without consent. Any claims you have regarding the lake's ecosystem are irrelevant to my legal ownership of the land. If you persist, I will have to involve law enforcement, and I assure you, the evidence I have collected will leave no room for misinterpretation." Her eyes widened for just a fraction of a second before narrowing again, that fierce determination flaring in the familiar way that had originally intimidated me. But this time, the flame of her aggression was being carefully assessed and contained by my unwavering posture. I noticed a subtle quiver in her hand as she held the clipboard. Her meticulous control of the neighborhood was slipping. I had, in effect, forced her into improvisation, a space where her well-rehearsed routines could no longer shield her. She hesitated, glancing down the street where neighbors were now cautiously observing from their porches, some with discreetly raised eyebrows that spoke volumes. They had been silent witnesses of her domination, and now they were, subtly but undeniably, my allies in presence if not yet in voice. I will schedule a board review," she stammered, her mind clearly working frantically for any course of action that would allow her to regain leverage. I shook my head slightly, almost empathetically, letting her realize she had nowhere to maneuver. "Karen, the board has already been informed of your harassment. Any further attempts to intimidate, threaten, or enter my property without permission will be documented and pursued through legal channels. This is your final warning." That was the turning point. I could see it in her face: panic, anger, disbelief, and, perhaps most importantly, the faintest recognition that she had underestimated me. Over the next few days, I implemented a series of measures to ensure that her attempts at sabotage would be neutralized before they could gain traction. Security cameras captured every approach, every whispered complaint, every unauthorized inspection. Detailed logs and documented evidence were submitted to the HOA attorney, reinforcing the undeniable pattern of harassment. Karen tried to escalate via official channels, sending formal letters laden with legal-sounding terminology, but they were immediately countered with documented proof of her misconduct, leaving her correspondence impotent and ineffective. The neighborhood, which had once been a silent stage for her theatrics, began to subtly rally. Small interactions, smiles, nods, casual greetings, signaled their awareness that I was standing firm, legally justified, and strategically prepared. Karen's isolation became increasingly evident. Her power, once so palpable, now hung by a thread of threatened litigation and eroding trust. One evening, in a particularly audacious attempt to reclaim control, she organized what she called a community compliance inspection, walking door to door to persuade neighbors to support her fabricated claims against me. I anticipated this move. Armed with evidence, knowledge of the law, and the silent, but perceptibly present, support of the community, I followed her discreetly, documenting the interactions. Neighbors, hesitant at first, quietly deflected her, referencing the legality of my ownership, the documented harassment, and the absurdity of her claims. Her frustration was visible, her voice rising at times, her carefully curated calm unraveling in real time. I realized then that this had become more than a personal confrontation, it was a battle for legitimacy, authority, and truth in the face of entitlement. By the end of that week, Karen's desperate tactics had begun to implode. The HOA attorney scheduled a formal hearing to evaluate her conduct, citing the extensive documentation of harassment and intimidation. Karen's attempts at coercion had created an unassailable paper trail that could not be ignored. I prepared for the hearing with meticulous care, knowing that presenting the evidence clearly, logically, and confidently would be critical to finalizing the inevitable outcome. When the day arrived, I entered the room with calm authority, files neatly organized, security footage queued for presentation, and my professional demeanor fully intact. Karen, seated across from me, attempted her usual performance of controlled dominance, but it faltered as I methodically laid out every incident, the unauthorized visits, the harassing letters, the misrepresentations to neighbors, and the misuse of HOA authority. Each point was supported with incontrovertible evidence. Her eyes flickered nervously, and her usual rapid-fire attempts at manipulation were met with direct, factual rebuttals. The board, initially neutral and perhaps even sympathetic to her in past meetings, now looked upon her behavior with concern, noting the repeated escalation and the inappropriate nature of her interventions. When the attorney finally concluded their summary of my submissions, the room fell into a tense silence. Karen's hands shook slightly as she clutched her clipboard, the board's decision was imminent. The verdict was unanimous. Karen's attempts at coercion, harassment, and intimidation were unacceptable. She was formally reprimanded, her authority over lake-related enforcement temporarily suspended pending further review, and she was warned that any future misconduct could result in removal from the HOA leadership. I allowed myself a small, private smile, recognizing the culmination of careful planning, patience, and steadfast assertion of rights. The lake, the property, and my peace were secure, not by brute force, but by strategy, documentation, and calm authority. That evening, as I walked along the dock, the lake stretching quietly under the fading light, I felt a deep sense of victory. Karen's desperation had only amplified the clarity of her misdeeds, and justice had prevailed without a single act of unnecessary aggression on my part. I had reclaimed not only my property but also the narrative, turning a would-be harasser into a cautionary example of overreach, and solidifying my place in a community that had begun to respect law, fairness, and reason above intimidation. And as the moon reflected off the still waters, I realized that this was more than a personal victory, it was a lesson in resilience, preparation, and the quiet, strategic power of standing your ground with unwavering certainty. The days after the formal HOA hearing were almost surreal. Karen, once the untouchable queen of Willow Lake, had retreated into a fragile silence that contrasted sharply with the confident presence she once exuded. Her office in the HOA building remained empty more often than not, and the neighbors, emboldened by my legal vindication, began reclaiming their autonomy. I noticed small but meaningful changes. Lawn decorations returned to yards that had been barren under her strict standards, kids played on the lake's edge without the fear of reprimand, and casual conversations flowed freely without the cautious whispers that had dominated the previous months. I walked the neighborhood often, observing the subtle but profound shift in morale. People smiled, waved, and even approached me with stories of their own minor struggles under Karen's authority. Some offered apologies for having hesitated to speak before, Others thanked me quietly for enduring and confronting the harassment so decisively. It was a remarkable transformation, a community slowly breathing again after a long period of suppression. Karen herself became a figure of quiet frustration, visible in her desperate attempts to maintain some semblance of control, but everyone could see the cracks in her facade. It wasn't just the board reprimanding her, it was the neighborhood's awareness that her tactics were no longer effective. But the most satisfying moment came unexpectedly. About 2 weeks after the board's decision, I received a letter in the mail, thick, official, and clearly typed with care. It was from Karen herself, though not the usual barrage of threats or veiled ultimatums. Instead, it was a formal resignation from her position as HOA president. The letter was carefully worded, acknowledging the documented complaints, the board's review, and her own inability to continue in her role without causing further disruption. I read it twice, the weight of its significance settling in. Karen had lost the authority she had wielded like a weapon, and the board had accepted her resignation, cementing the legal and symbolic victory. I filed the letter with the attorney for record-keeping and allowed myself a private, unrestrained smile. But there was more. In the weeks following her resignation, the neighborhood began to flourish in ways that Karen's rule had stifled. Lake events were organized without fear, docks were maintained collaboratively, and community gatherings became an avenue for genuine connection rather than a stage for intimidation. I found myself invited to barbecues, fishing tournaments, and casual coffee meetups. It was as though the entire community had been quietly waiting for someone to break the spell, and by standing my ground, I had catalyzed a renaissance of neighborly trust and engagement. Yet, even with Karen's formal exit, I knew that complacency was not an option. Subtle reminders of her influence lingered, old rules buried in the HOA bylaws, unexplored clauses that could potentially be twisted in the wrong hands. I took it upon myself to review every document, ensuring that future residents would be shielded from similar harassment. And then came the final twist, the poetic justice that sealed the entire saga. One morning, I received an anonymous package at my doorstep. Inside was a set of HOA records spanning decades, letters, internal communications, and confidential documents that revealed Karen's long-standing pattern of manipulation and intimidation, not just toward me, but toward virtually every new resident she had encountered. It was a goldmine of evidence, should any legal matters arise, and an undeniable confirmation that the struggle I had endured was part of a much larger pattern. I realized immediately that this package was not a threat, but a gift, a safeguard for the neighborhood and a final lesson for Karen that her tactics could not escape accountability. I placed the documents securely in my home office, ready to use them if ever necessary, and felt an overwhelming sense of closure. The lake shimmered in the late afternoon light, serene and undisturbed, as though reflecting the restoration of balance in the community. I stepped onto my dock, breathing in the crisp, clean air, and let the quiet wash over me. For months, I had endured threats, intimidation, and absurd bureaucratic attempts to assert authority over my own property. But through patience, preparation, and unwavering adherence to law and reason, I had emerged victorious, not just personally, but for the neighborhood as a whole. Karen's downfall had been complete, her authority stripped, her influence diminished, and her ability to manipulate permanently curtailed. And the community, once cowed into silence, had rediscovered its voice, its confidence, and its shared sense of harmony. I leaned back on the railing of my dock, watching the ripples play across the surface of the lake, and smiled. The battle had been long and exhausting, but the victory was more than legal, it was moral, social, and deeply satisfying. In the end, Karen's obsession had been her undoing, and my steadfast resolve had not only preserved my rights but had transformed an entire community. Willow Lake was no longer under the shadow of fear, it thrived in the light of fairness, reason, and the undeniable proof that authority, when misused, can be challenged and overcome. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the water, I felt a profound sense of peace. The lake, my home, and the neighborhood were secure, and Karen, finally, had nowhere left to hide.